Right, thank you. I knew that would be a fulsome discussion, and it was. So let's move on now to our next critical issue, which is our review, the Auckland Cultural and Heritage Sector Review. And I do want to acknowledge the visitors that we have with us from the sector, particularly Professor David Gainstup, the new lead at the Auckland Museum. It's lovely to have you here, and of course William Randall, Michael Frawley from MOTAT, and other representatives of the organisations. Just before we start this, and I know there's been a huge amount of interest in this sectoral review, this is now our time to have a look at this cultural sector as a whole, and to make sure that as we visit cities overseas who have thriving and well-functioning cultural centres that are well governed and understandable to their communities, we're aiming for the same thing. This work has been started through parts of the reviews that were done, and the framework that was set out, and this now takes us to the next step. We heard from our Howick Village representatives, and we're now going to hear from our staff, who will explain quite clearly why we are holding this as a first and initial piece of work that is done with our large organisations. And we do have, and I know Ed's got some words that I think may give our Howick representatives a little bit of hope in this process when we come to the recommendations. But this isn't going back to first principles, this is actually having a look at how we can make these major institutions more functional, more successful, and to greater reflect the huge amount of work that they already do. Okay, right. Ed and Alistair, warm welcome. And Ed, particular acknowledgement to you for this huge amount of the work that you've done already. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning, and good morning, Mr Mayor, councillors. The purpose of this paper this morning is to approve the terms of reference for the review of Auckland's cultural heritage institutions, which the Finance and Performance Committee established in March. Fundamentally, the review is about getting the best out of our cultural heritage investment, which is over $60 million a year. I just want to make some brief remarks about three key aspects of the review and the terms of reference: the strategic context in which it takes place, the scope of the review, and the key purposes of the review. The key strategic context for the review is set by Toi Whetiki, the Auckland Arts and Culture Strategic Action Plan. Council adopted Toi Whetiki in late 2014 following an extensive period of development of the strategy by the Auckland cultural sector. Toi Whetiki therefore sets the basic parameters for the proposed review, notably in two areas. Firstly, to ensure governance and funding arrangements of council-funded institutions enable them to operate sustainably and collaboratively, and secondly, to support a network of complementary arts and cultural institutions and facilities. In terms of scope for the review, we propose that the review will focus on our major cultural heritage institutions, namely Auckland Museum, Auckland Art Gallery, MOTAT, the New Zealand Maritime Museum, and Stardome Observatory and Planetarium. This is a very deliberate choice that we're making here, and the focus on these institutions is because these are Auckland's regional scale institutions. They're the ones where there's the most to gain from an improved system. They're the ones with the most current pressing issues, and dealing with these institutions keeps the review manageable in scale. We do recognise, thinking about what was said this morning by the Howick Historical Village, that there are other institutions of a medium and small scale around the city which are part of the Auckland cultural heritage ecosystem. We propose that these are dealt with at a later stage, but that the reviewers are asked to consult those institutions and take account of their perspectives when making their recommendations. Just to quickly remind you of the key purposes of this review, the first is to set out whether there's a case for change to achieve greater strategic and structural coherence and value from council investment in the cultural heritage sector. Secondly, the review should determine the key strategic objectives and priorities we should be seeking from our council investment. And thirdly, having determined those strategic priorities, state what needs to change in sector governance and structure to support and achieve that. The terms of reference also sets out a few more specific issues for consideration, including things such as MOTAT's investment needs, the New Zealand Maritime Museum and Stardome's respective locations, the role of regional facilities Auckland as it relates to cultural heritage, the legislative levy systems for Auckland Museum and MOTAT, opportunities for a more collaborative model as is common in cities overseas, and I refer you to the second attachment to the report, which gives some examples of such systems. But fundamentally, what we really want the review to do is explore what might work for Auckland and respect the mana and strengths of the institutions, how they've developed over time, and how they continue to evolve, and some of their special purposes, thinking, for example, of the Auckland War Memorials, the Auckland Museum's War Memorial function. So happy to take questions.
Thank you. Thanks, Ed. Councillor Simpson. So we'll just do questions first, then we'll move to the recommendations.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I've got two questions. Could you please just clarify for me the definition of institutions operating at a regional level, because that was the understanding. And the second thing, my second question is the terms of reference. You say they were developed in conjunction with, and you list the organisations. Were the terms of reference approved by those organisations? I mean, were they happy with the terms of reference?
I'll take the second question first. What we didn't seek specific sign-off of the terms of reference, but we did send round an initial draft and a revised draft to the institutions and incorporated their feedback. On the first question, it's a matter of judgment really about which institutions are regional in scale, but those 5 institutions typically respond to the needs of the wider region rather than being specifically embedded in a particular part of one of Auckland's many communities.
Yeah, I'm just not sure that of your answer on the second question. I just heard the Howick village, and they're saying they do operate regionally. Just because they're called Howick, people might think it's just Howick, but potentially it's a bit wider than that. So I'm not really sure I've got an answer for operating. I mean, all these institutions are in someone's area. So you could say that the Stardome was, it could have been called the Mount Eden Stardome. So I'm just not sure. I haven't really got the reasoning why they're not incorporated.
So you want a sense of how do we understand the uniqueness, the scope and the reach of the organisations that have been chosen?
Yeah. I think if I could just suggest, Madam Chair, that Parliament has in fact decided that 4 of these institutions are of regional significance and put legislation in place to ensure that they are funded regionally.
That's 4 of them, right?
The Maritime Museum and Stardome are part of the regional amenities funding legislation. MOTAT and the War Memorial Museum both have their own acts of parliament to ensure that they were funded by the former local authorities of Auckland. So
that's the driver. That's
Parliament decided that they were of regional significance.
The report doesn't reflect that potentially is the driver.
I think it's kind of inherent in there, but when we're explaining it to people, we need to make that absolutely clear. Good question, Councillor. Councillor Clow.
Yeah, I have similar concerns as Councillor Simpson, and I'll come back to those later, but these are just questions, 2 questions. Can you define built cultural heritage institutions which are excluded? Isn't Auckland Museum a built cultural heritage institution?
The reference to built cultural heritage there is not to institutions, but to, for example, listed historic houses. So that's getting into the work of the heritage team at council rather than the institutions.
And in the terms on page 30, the review should take into consideration the following specific aspects or issues, and there's a list of entities there. Yet the arts, community and events section of the council, which is under Dean's command, who are the authors of Te Whetiki, have not actually been asked to be part of this or be consulted. Seems a bit unusual when they put together the overall strategy.
The intention here is to take Toiwhetiki and look at one specific subsector rather than deal with the whole sector again. There's a significant amount of work had been done through Toiwhetiki, and I think what we're doing here is identifying that we've got some specific issues with cultural heritage institutions that we need to address. We acknowledge that there are potentially issues with some of the other institutions, but I think that we want to keep this manageable and coherent.
Third one is, and it goes back to Councillor Simpson, so we've got a number of institutions that would argue they are regional as well, and clearly the Para Estate and the James Wallace Trust is a significant one. Te Uru and Lopdale out in Titirangi, the Corbyn's Estate in Henderson, and there's a couple of other examples, and of course there's the Howard example. They have pretty major budgetary considerations, and there is a bit of inequity in some of the way they're done. And then importantly, and I'm specifically referring to Te Uru and the Para Estate, it's really important they work collaboratively with the Auckland Art Museum and between all of them, because there's a vast body of work. Indeed, about 99% of the artwork is actually used in storage, which obviously we want to move it around and get it displayed as much as possible. Yet they're not part of this review, when that's a huge part of, looking on page 27, it's a huge part of the strategic context to operate under 2.11, to operate sustainably and collaboratively, to meet gaps, and 3.11 to meet gaps in future provision. It just seems a huge gap there that we're missing. I mean, it's a bit like doing the Port Future study and only doing 2/3 of it. I can't help why we would want to address some of these bigger questions later, because yeah, there's a lot of other quite large entities out there that, and the Wallace Estate, which is booming, is probably the best one, a really good example, and yet it's not been considered. And I know it's under the Parks Department, or the building is, but anyway, we don't need to go there.
I can see
under the local
Kat
board.
itching to make a comment. Probably this is as good a time as any, because I think some of these questions will be about that. We're just drawing a little ripple diagram here. We've got the central, the core that we're looking at here, and I think what people aren't seeing, what I'm hearing from Councillor Clough and Councillor Simpson, is what's the hook or the next step that's actually going to deal with some of these? Are they completely out in the dark to be ignored, or are they the next tier out that will be considered? So, Kat, do you want to comment on Councillor Clough's issues?
Yes. Just through the chair, I just think we need to note that the scope of this work, particularly led by these two gentlemen, is around those institutions where we have little control over funding. This is why staff from our CCO area are leading this. The rest of the work that many of you are talking about is highly linked to Toiwhetiki. It is in the realms of this committee's delegations, and my area leads both the parks, community facilities and events portion of all of that. And we are happy to take recommendations or actions that, if you want to have a wider look at how you invest going forward, like we are doing with many of our parks approaches, that we could bring a scope back to the committee, clearly linked to Toiwhetiki, and opening up for you to have a wider view of investment under Toiwhetiki and how you might want to do that more going into the future. We could bring that back for you to have a look at.
Just a further comment though, I mean, we're going to bring in an international expert, and then, you know, maybe someone from New Zealand and finance and whatever. So we're spending a bit of money on this, and it just seems that I would imagine when they come here, say an international person who, I don't know, may have dealt with Melbourne or whatever, and who will say, well, wait a minute, let's have a look at the next level down, and indeed would be hugely interested to be visiting those entities to sort of see. And I go back to the strategic context of the terms, you know, you know, we grow and deliver strategic investment and support a network of complementary arts and, so, you know, on page 27, we said 2.1 and 3.1 are pretty crucial, and it does have that cascading effect. And we don't need to get down to the real smaller ones, but we've got another level that are very substantial organisations, and I just emphasise again the collaborative nature that we want them to operate under.
Could we do both?
I'll let, you know, that's my point.
Alistair?
Madam Chair, I think our advice to you on this review is that the greatest challenges and opportunities that we've identified in this sector from our perspective are with these regional scale ones. We're never envisaging that that is the end of the issue. We're just advising you that let's do this work, let's get this right, cognizant of those sub-regional and smaller organisations that are out there, and then that work can be done later to plug that in. We're not saying ignore those, because they are part of the context which the regional institutions operate in, but to make this a manageable piece of work and to get it done in a reasonable sort of time frame, if we keep expanding the scope and increasing the number of institutions that we're dealing with, and one of the things here is to try to get some form of common view about what these institutions are trying to achieve. The more that we pull into it, the harder that's going to be and the longer that it will take. Our advice to you to keep this manageable and to address, I guess, some of the greatest opportunities here is to focus purely on these big strategic regional institutions at this stage. But that is not to say we shouldn't look at those sub-regional and other institutions at another time.
I don't mean to be gloomy though, but I mean, there's 3 or 4 of them got their own acts of parliament. If I was chair of the board or on the board of Auckland Museum, I'd be fighting like hell to retain my privileged position, and it may be we get nowhere.
Don't be gloomy, councillor. I'm trying to be the eternal optimist here.
And we just, you know, we can end up down a whole bunch of rabbit holes if we want to with this one. It's my understanding, and I choose to be absolutely glass half full on this one. We've got the museum here, we've got Motate here, we've got a bunch of committed, positive, hard-working cultural institutions who, in their own words, want to act collaboratively to get the best for the cultural sector. The bottom line is, and if you look at these, the thing that all of these organisations have in common is that they've either got an Act of Parliament which kind of controls and governs them, or they're under CCO governance. But the bottom line is they are our cultural sector over which, I see you, Councillor Cooper.
I'm sorry.
We're on here. You know, over which we have some control, but not all control. And as soon as we start to water this down to all cultural institutions, art galleries and other organisations, I think we're actually going to lose the plot. We've struggled to get a handle on this for the 6 years that I've been part of this council. I think we need to start making some progress. So I hear the concerns. And what we're missing out of this is, as Katarina put it, how do we deal with our other cultural institutions, and how do we make sure that in parallel fashion we're managing them well as a well-supported sector. And we've got pretty much the rest of the council who wish to speak to this. Councillor Wayne Walker. I'll just tell you who we've got, just so you know you're there. Councillor Walker, Collins, Quack, Simpson, Fletcher and Cooper.
Sure.
I was just going to move it, Madam Chair, but that's...
I was just going to second it then.
Well, so we will note that,
Like,
and we will thank you warmly for the moving and seconding, but we'll just
No, it's
listen
on
to
the
the next
table.
3 speakers.
Like Councillor Clow, I've got a few questions, and I just acknowledge that, for me anyway, this is a very important issue. My first question just goes to the terms of reference, and I'll have a small preamble, and that's around the Auckland Museum, which has a collection that is not just an Auckland collection, it's a national and international in terms of its substance in many areas, particularly in the Māori and Pacific area. So my question goes to the terms of reference, which I would suggest doesn't adequately reflect that. It's very Auckland-centric. Is there a possibility to make some changes to the terms of reference to take in those more national and international considerations?
I think I think that's a fair point, Councillor. I think the way we're trying to deal with that is by specifically referencing in the consultation section at the very end that the reviewers that we appoint should go and talk to the central government agencies such as Ministry for Culture and Heritage. And through them we've been trying to keep the Minister for Culture and Heritage up to date with this review. And I think those national and international considerations are important and they'll be brought through by that process.
Okay, just in response to that, I understand that answer, but my concern is if I read the terms of reference, it makes no reference to the national and the international significance of some of these collections.
Okay.
So,
Point noted, councillor.
so
we've
I
got
would
the,
I would
we
like to
can
see
add-
it in there. I don't know whether other councillors share that opinion, but this is an incredibly important collection, particularly, as I say, to Māori and Pacific. So I don't see it in there. My other question goes to 20, which is around implementation, and that follows on from the last question. What we've got here in terms of the how that we do it is that staff will consider the operational matters, including considering the panel to make appointments and the like. I have a real concern that we need some truly independent people in this process, truly independent and of international stature.
How much is that going to cost?
I don't think it's adequate just to leave this to officers. And through you, Madam Chair, part of my reason around this, my concern, is we had a report to Councillor Clo's committee a little while ago, and that made particular criticism of the Auckland Museum. And the museum responded, and responded quite clearly, at significant odds with the advice that we received from our officers around the performance of the museum, around other metrics, around the costs associated with the museum. So I have a real concern around the information that we might be working off to date amongst our officers, and really it goes to the need for independence. I'm sure councillors saw the letter that came from the museum. It was dated the 30th of March and it was addressed to Councillor Clo, and I understand Councillor Clo distributed it to all the councillors. It was of real concern, this letter.
Okay, Alistair, did you
So
want to comment?
my question goes to independence
Um,
and selection of the panel.
Through the chair, no offence taken. The couple of number of points there. First of all, yes, we are aware of that letter that was sent, and we could have responded with our point of view, but we thought that rather than getting into another exchange of correspondence, that perhaps we would focus more on the review and the possibilities that are here. The point about independence is absolutely taken on board. The intention of this is to get an international expert in to undertake this review. All the report is saying is staff will manage the process of appointing that person or people, whoever they may be. So we are not intending to do this review ourselves. We will be getting somebody independent in to do it.
Thank you. Your point's noted though, and we'll make sure, Councillor Walker, that we pick up the issue of the international significance of the museum.
Through you, Madam Chair.
Yep.
Just a related issue, and that goes to that earlier meeting, and it goes to the metrics around the museum. I just want to put on record that certainly my observation is we have a museum of international stature with metrics that are at the top echelon of museums in the world in terms of its performance. So I just want to put that on record. That's my understanding, and I think it would be useful for that sort of information to be given to councillors, because it is an outstanding museum that we have. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Sure is. I don't think anyone would disagree. Councillor Collins.
Thanks, Chair. Just two questions in relation to the terms of reference. On point 14, page 25, bullet point 2, the international evidence about best practice governance models for this type of investment in cities. I'm interested to see or to know if those discussions will include perhaps the diversity of the makeup of governance boards, including women, people from different ethnic backgrounds, expertise. Do you envisage that being the case?
I think the review is probably operating at a slightly higher level than that, but when we get to considering the recommendations of the review in 2018, that there will be quite significant thought given to those kind of considerations when you are starting to put together a potentially a new collaborative governance structure. I think that will be really important.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Collins. Councillor Quacks.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. In terms of the terms of reference, just refer you to bottom of page 24, para 13 and bullet point number 2. Just a bit of clarification around that. Implications for related institutions and smaller cultural organisations will be considered, but are not the primary focus at this time. So we've heard from the Howick Historic Village this morning. So my question really is, what part of the review will those related institutions, what part of the review will they form?
I suspect that what will happen is that we can probably add something in the consultation part of the terms of reference that ensures that those institutions are spoken to, and furthermore that the reviewers will probably come back with recommendations beyond the core of 5 and say these are some of the implications that you need to now consider for some of your medium-sized and smaller institutions. And so I think it will be in the recommendation phase, and it will be recommendations for us to consider as we implement the review.
If I could just add to that, Madam Chair, I mean, one of the key directions in Toi Whatiki was to ensure that the governance and funding arrangements allowed the institutes to operate cohesively as a network. And I think that's one of the things that we're really trying to explore here. And, without jumping to the end of this, that would include those other institutions. And when we come to making recommendations here, I couldn't imagine making a recommendation which would somehow exclude these other institutions from somehow being part of that wider ecosystem.
Okay, because now, what is the timeline on this? Because one of the things that concerns me is, we've said a lot of things about the other institutions that are not included in the terms of reference, going into the future at a later stage, and so forth. So, I'd like to get some timeline on what is considered here, and so that when, because I think we're looking at a 2-stage project here, and it certainly would be my hope that the Howick Historic Village is somebody in my ward. It would be sooner rather than later. So can you give me an idea of what kind of timeline we're talking about here?
There's been a significant amount of work already been done in this area, so we're hoping that the main part of this review can be completed this calendar year.
So we'd be aiming to report this back to you either by the end of this year or the very beginning of 2018, but that depends on the people out there who will actually be undertaking this review, what their availability and capacity is.
Okay, and that will give us some a roadmap, if you like, to going forward to these other institutions which are not included in the terms of reference.
Yes.
And I think be clear about that. Councillor Simpson.
Yeah, I think everyone's heading in a similar direction to me. So I was just going to end by saying this is $250,000 of unbudgeted money we're putting ahead for this, and I don't want to waste of that money. So my point was really around how much If you had all these international experts here, how much extra would it cost to keep them for a little bit longer and do some of the minor stuff at the same time? Or are you saying, actually, no, we just will spend this amount of money at the high level? And I get the principle of that, and we can do the rest on our own. Just kind of balancing that, really. So it's just value for money. Do it once, do it properly.
I can't give you an accurate estimate of how much extra it would cost to do that. I think my advice to you is more about doability and timeliness, that if we were to extend it out, whether we'd be able to get a sort of joined up agreement between the various institutions in the sector, and within time where it may, some of the recommendations from this may have impacts on the LTP, who knows? That's always our sort of...
I think, councillors, it's good to remember this is $61 million annually that we spend on this part of the sector. We need to be focused, and we actually need to be a bit brave, and we can keep watering it down and avoiding the tough discussions. I know that our institutions are actually up for the tough discussions, and I don't want to second guess them, but I'm feeling that if we started to water this down and expand it, that we may risk angering and distancing the very sector that we're trying to work with to support. So I know that we're trying to do the right thing, but, you know, I think we just need to trust the process a bit here and understand that our Arts and Cultural Centre, as Kataraina has put, we have the ability to kind of put our arms around that sector and have a parallel process to ensure that they're well supported and nurtured as we go into the LTP. But I guess I'm asking for a bit of focus and bravery here. Councillor Lee.
Thank you, Madam Chair. May I ask, in regard to the terms of reference, is the Heritage Advisory Panel going to be consulted on this matter?
My understanding, the Heritage Advisory Panel focused more on built heritage, but if the terms of reference of the panel extend to the institutions that we're dealing with, then I don't see
Cultural
any reason.
heritage as well. Can I say, Madam Chair, that I have some concerns, not that there's going to be a review, because review and strategy building and all that sort of stuff is the stock and trade of council administration. So we do reviews all the time. What I am concerned about is reviews that may do harm.
Here.
And some of these institutions, as other councillors have noted, have an international reputation because they are internationally valuable in terms of world culture. Certainly they are valuable for Auckland and New Zealand. I'm just a little bit concerned about the terminology because it tends to signal intentions. The reports are laced with finance sector jargon, which worries me, which I don't think is appropriate, quite inappropriate when dealing with cultural institutions. And then you have some weird conjugations, things like a cultural ecosystem, and things like cultural infrastructure and leveraging ecosystem outcomes. You know, it's a bit like Margaret Thatcher visits the British Museum with a non-positive intention. I think we have to be very, very careful that we don't see a repetition of the disgraceful matters that are going on with our library system, with 74 people being sent down the road, the lowest paid people,
Actually,
and that's one of our most popular
Councillor,
and precious
can we
cultural
just stick
resources.
to the
So I am
item
concerned
on
about
hand?
the intention here,
Good.
Madam Chair,
I hear
that this
you.
is another neoliberal reform of something that should not be touched and damaged.
Okay. So I
Really?
guess, and we'll go on to our next speaker, which is going to be Member Brown, but I think we also need to remember that a city or an organisation that refuses to change is a non-evolutionary organisation,
Yeah.
and you're more likely to die or become completely irrelevant. And for people who don't support death and irrelevance of important organisations like this, I think we do need to keep up with what our community expect of us, to make sure that we steward their finances well, and to make sure that we're relevant on the international
Madam Chair, I
stage.
think some of our
I'd now
librarians
like to
would have
move
something
on.
to
I'm
say
moving
about
on. I'm
less
moving
than
on to,
optimally developed workforce. What does that mean?
and isn't it shocking?
For
that
real
we-
people.
Councillor, we'll keep that to another day, thank you. Member Brown.
Kia ora. Now, just in your report, I note the Māori impact statement. I further note, due to legislation actually, and I need to say that partly the approach is flawed because the legislation is flawed, because you're relying in your report on one nano group of Māori that you named as the taumata iwi, whom under the legislation were created for primarily one iwi. In post 2008, there's been a revelation that the Crown are treating with 13 of the iwi. So I can see a flaw in your approach on the methodology you're taking around the Māori community. So if you're relying, or the approach is to rely upon one nano body, which I understand to be 3 members, you are inadvertently excluding 16 mana whenua and all of Mātā Waka. If I pick up the earlier comments, whether mana whenua or Mātā Waka, Māori generally have some form of possession within your possession that you're hosting and accommodating. So I'm wanting to know, is there a secondary process post the review that encourages those of us not at that taumata to be able to contribute into the review?
Tēnā koe, Mr Brown. I think the intention here wasn't so much to get the reviewers to use the taumata iwi as a conduit for Māori perspectives, but more just to consider in a wider sense what in the future is the role of Māori in a more collaborative model. The intention is actually to have a look at what's good about that system, what might need changing about that system, and so it's really not about a narrow focus on that. And we do expect, and we've made reference in the consultation, that consultation needs to be quite wide in that respect.
Thank you. It's just with the investment of bringing in offshore people, it's actually going to be a real punch in the guts should they not come and meet Māori who actually have a genuine interest and a sincere contribution to make into the review. Kia ora.
I think if I could just speak to that just a wee bit further, I think one of the key things that is hopefully emphasised in there that and I'll just refer to the report, paragraph 17 of the report, Auckland's cultural heritage institutions have a crucial role to play in achieving outcomes for Māori as set out in the Auckland plan. So I think we'll be asking a reviewer how best to make that actually happen, is the question.
Isn't that slightly unfair because these people may not even be a New Zealander?
On that, there has been quite a bit of talk this morning about having a group of international experts. I think we need to get away from thinking that it will necessarily be a group of internationals. There might be one international person, and we do intend to make sure that they're well supported by people who understand the context here in New Zealand.
And we make an assumption you're in dialogue with council officials who can actually help you, help us, help you. Kia ora.
No, point well made, Member Brown, thank you. Councillor Fletcher.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. My hand up before was simply to either move or to second. And I didn't intend to speak, but I will in light of some of the concerns that have been expressed. I really strongly support this review and being kept at a relatively high level. What we're trying to do is establish the case for change, if there's a case for change, the strategic priorities, and any possible structural or governance changes that might be necessary. as somebody who's been quite critical of the ARAFA legislation and who wanted to see that being incorporated at the time of amalgamation, this is going to be the very sort of review that will give us the insight that we need. It's problematic to take on reviews of this kind because this comes to the very core of what we hold dear in our values and most precious institutions. And consultation is always extremely difficult. Speaking from the voice of experience, having undertaken the review of the arts sector back in the early 90s, that generated, the review of the Arts Commission at the time, generated more submissions than electoral reform for MMP, because it was just, people feel so passionately about it. And I would hate to think that we are going to bog ourselves down in the minutiae without actually having explored what the journey might be. So I have confidence that our officials have put this together very, very wisely. It will give us the insights that we need on what government might wish to do with some of the governance arrangements we have at the moment. And I also believe that our senior institutions are of a mind to be as collaborative as possible on this, and I really would commend to those councillors who are concerned that this isn't value for money. I think what would not be value for money is to widen the terms of reference and have everybody wanting to be part of the process, because it would end up costing a fortune. So I think this is really a good initiative, and I support you, and any minor changes I think we should just be feeding through to you independently offline.
Thank you, Councillor Fletcher. Your experience is invaluable, and I think we've seen a little bit of the passion sort of bubble up in this meeting today. Finally, Councillor Hills.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to briefly say that I agree with Councillor Fletcher and your comments. This sort of was kicked off a few months ago with very directive, and now I think changing it would be wrong. The other thing is we've had contact from various arts institutions from the shore who would like to be involved, and I think it would be difficult if we start including some and miss out some, and we just throw in the ones we are aware of. And we also don't want to step on the toes of local boards, and how does that affect these institutions are very clearly regional, funded by the council. They're under our discussion. So although I really respect our local institutions and the many ones who are regional or see themselves as regional, which would include some of the ones in our area, and places like Kawa Historical Village. Yes, I understand that, but I think this is very specific what this was asked for. So I think it's better to keep it in this way for now. Otherwise, we will open a can of worms to include institutions from right across Auckland, and then we might start upsetting local boards and other things as well. So just need to be careful of that. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hills. I've got Mayor Goff, then Councillor Cooper, who'll close the debate. We've moved into speaking to the recommendations with the last three speakers. So, Mayor Goff.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Can I just remind councillors that when I spoke at the introduction of this item before Finance and Performance, I mentioned that I'd been and talked or rung all of the cultural institutions that are encompassed by this report. Every one of them supported the holding of this review. Every one of them. The question of whether this review will be valuable or not, I don't think is in debate. But make no mistake about it, this is a big review. It's not going to be easy to do. It's going to require incredible sensitivity, and it's going to require independence. And what I think we'll be envisaging here is that we have an international cultural expert that is outside of the day-to-day goings-on in New Zealand, and probably somebody locally that might have the status of a person that can look at how the governance and how the financial rules are working. I think in order to enhance its independence, we need those people. I think we also need those people not to be chosen simply by officials, so I congratulate the officials for the work they've done. I think they've done an incredibly good job on this. But I think in choosing that panel, we need to have a political oversight on that. So I'm suggesting, Madam Chair, that under implementation item number 20, this will include considering a panel to make appointments for the review. I'd add, with your agreement, in consultation with the Chair and Deputy Chair of the Environment and Community Committee. I just think that takes it away from being a purely official-driven appointment to one that has political oversight. I also want to support the Chair in suggesting that if we're to move this forward, it has to be constrained to something that's manageable. When I looked at what had been done in this area, we had the Toi Fatiki report in 2014, we had the Walker report in 2015, and here we are in 2017, and neither of those reports have been acted on. The bigger we make this, the longer it will take, the less manageable it will be. I have every sympathy for the Howick Historical Village Society. I think they do a fantastic job out there. Thanks very much, Rob. But I think, as the terms of reference point out, the primary focus needs to be on the major institutions that are consuming at the moment in excess of $60 million. I regard that $60 million as an investment, not a cost. This is not a cost-cutting exercise, but the focus needs to be on the three Cs, if I can put it that way, which is greater coordination, cohesiveness and collaboration, because that's what's lacking at the moment. We've got to wonder whether it makes sense to have a whole lot of institutions working in the same sphere, working under different legislation, different funding arrangements and different forms of reporting. Now, when you do that, you've also got to be sensitive to the need for those institutions operationally to have a degree of independence in how they operate. It is a big task, but please don't make it bigger by extending the terms of reference. Let's deal with the smaller but nevertheless important institutions as something that the report will look at, but the primary focus needs to be on the key institutions. And I think it would be helpful, if I can come back to the amendment that I'm suggesting, Madam Chair, just to have that degree of political oversight in terms of appointment of the panel. That, not that I think officials would do it, but it moves us away from the perception that the officials are appointing something that's going to reflect what officials might be looking for, rather than this body, which is the governing body. So I'd move that accordingly, Madam Chair, if you'd be keen to support it.
Chairman, I'm happy to add it into the original resolution if Councillor Fletcher is, to pop it in there as a C, rather than a whole amendment process.
Right,
Yep.
but the appointments and reforms.
I don't mind where it goes.
Yeah,
It's just
then
the
we
intent
don't
of
have to
it
go
that's
through the whole
important.
voting thing.
All right, we'll work on the words. We just might have missed them at the beginning. I've got Councillor Cooper who'll close the debate at this stage. Is it urgent, Councillor Walker?
I just wanted to speak to Mayor Goff's issue around appointment, and that is that there may be other councillors aside from the chair and the deputy chair that would like to be appraised of the appointment process. I would have an interest in that. There may be others. It's pretty important.
Councillor, I think.
I just want to put that on record.
Okay, and I think we can report the process back, maybe via the Chairs Committee, and then talk to the councillors. We don't want to make an unnecessary meal of this, or over politicise this. If we want true independence, you know, whilst we might say we want some independence of staff, we possibly also want independence from politics as well. So let's just tread that line cautiously. Councillor Cooper, you'll close the debate.
Thank you, and it will be quick, Madam Chair. And I support the Mayor's and Councillor Fletcher's comments. This is a terms of reference, and I think it's pretty clear what we need to do. The tangled web we have now was developed. It wasn't developed for a regional council or a unitary council. It was developed for a whole bunch of reasons when we were disunited. So it's not fit for purpose anymore, the ERAFA legislation. So let's get this done, and then we can tease out what we need to do from the full report. I'm pleased that the staff have done a lot of the second level at that local level for organisations. That needs to happen so that local and very good organisations do not feel left out or ignored, that's going to happen. But what I do want to say, Madam Chair, is maybe there's an opportunity for the ARAFA fund, some of the ARAFA funds to be used for this rather than coming out of our long-term plan, and I don't know how we do that. Maybe it's a slight rise in the their percentage, which then just comes straight back to council to pay for this. Thank you, Madam Chair.
I think can of worms open. Maybe we don't.
Well, I'm not saying to take it away from the current funding, but maybe a slight increase, which then just translate to paying for it. It's going to be in the rates no matter what.
Okay.
But then it's very clear where that's come from and where it's going.
Deal with that separately. Thank you, Councillor Cooper. You've closed the debate. I'm going to put the recommendation, all those in, so the C that the Mayor recommended was just a bit of oversight from the Chair and the Deputy Chair on the, there we are, on the appointment. I'll put those three. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Against? Carried. Thank you very much, and thank you to the staff and acknowledging our institutions who are here. Let's do this with integrity and trust and forward sight. Thank you.